Hi, I'm Reed Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. If this is your first time listening, you're in for a treat, because here at Grief Refuge, we hold sacred space for your grief. This is where it gets honored, and you're invited to explore the deeper understandings of your grief process and grief journey. You'll find Grief Refuge to be very different from other grief-related podcasts. Instead of scratching the surface about grief, we go deeper. We go much deeper. This is where we understand how our grief works. I so appreciate your listenership, regardless whether this is your first or 54th time listening. I sincerely hope you feel more comforted, supported, and cared for as you navigate your grief journey. Because of the depth and nature of this topic, it may be more beneficial to stop multitasking while you're listening. Rather than be busy, I invite you to use this time for your self-care and personal reflection. Use this time to relax and allow your grief-related feelings to run their course. Take advantage of our time together to mourn your loss. In addition to today's interview, I also invite you to download the Grief Refuge app. On the app, there's more stories, more reflections, and more insights for healing and also navigating grief. To find it, just search Grief Refuge wherever you get your apps. Thank you, and let's move on to today's topic. Grief experts tend to find specific niches in the work that they do, and it's often they do what intrigues them because they want to learn more and they want to develop mastery. At the time of this recording, I was recognizing more frequent conversations with grievers who were putting the pressure on themselves to go through grief within a designated timeline. Even I was recognizing that I had some expectations I was putting on myself to be done with grief for some of the losses in my life. Having that awareness, I reached out to my friend Karyn Arnold over at Grief in Common to speak about grief in the second year of loss and beyond. I was delighted to learn from Karyn about important things that grievers set themselves up for. Some examples are not measuring up because you're still grieving, what to do with grief-related timelines, and compassion for when you're being hard on yourself. Karyn Arnold is the founder of Grief in Common. She has been working in the field of grief and loss for over 15 years, facilitating bereavement groups and providing support one-on-one, and also educating the community about the grief process. Grief in Common is an online community designed to connect those who are grieving based on background and similar experiences for chats and opportunities to meet in person. Grief in Common provides community support, bereavement groups, and a learning hub for deeper understandings about grief that is sometimes confusing or complicated. In our interview, Karyn provides wisdom, experience, and tremendous grief support skills. I hope you enjoy our conversation. It's filled with grief-related wisdom. Karyn Arnold, welcome to Grief Refuge.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm pretty excited that you're here because, as I found on your Grief in Common platform, you've got so much wisdom that you share and so much that you offer. And I'm really excited about exploring our topic of today, grief in the second year of loss, or grief somewhere where it's prolonged and people think that they're struggling. We've talked beforehand that our conversation is going to be organic. We've talked about how it's going to naturally flow. So I'm looking forward to this authentic conversation and what flows today.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too.
Karyn, I'd like to start with something I'm going to share from somebody is in their second year of loss. And it really stuck out for me. And it's putting you on the spot, or it may feel like it's putting you on the spot. I apologize if it feels that way. However, I feel like it'd be a great starting point. So I'm going to read this to you. It says, as the first anniversary of his passing started to draw near, I started to slightly unravel. The panic attacks were coming more frequently. My digestive system went on strike. I was losing so much hair. I felt this pressure to feel and act a certain way on that day. If I'm being honest, like most occasions in my life, the anticipation was much worse than the actual event itself. My son and I quietly slipped away to our favorite getaway. I posted a funny story about my husband on social media. We kept to ourselves and spent a few days completely unplugged. Then it was back home to wait for my certificate in the mail. It was a bittersweet time. I wanted to celebrate the milestones of having survived the whole year without him. But I also felt extremely disappointed that nothing seemed to change. I started to should on myself about being further along than I was. I would question the normalcy of my grief and compare myself to other widows. I would see others doing great things and would feel like I was behind in my progress. I felt like the timer went off and my time was up. Somewhere into the second year, I finally realized what everyone was talking about. It wasn't that it was worse. Nothing came up from the ground and swallowed me whole. There was no mental breakdown or apocalypse of any kind. The worst had already happened. It was that now shit was real. There was no more widow fog. There were no more firsts without him. There was no longer a memorial to plan. There weren't any more legal, financial, or other issues to keep me busy. And I had stopped drinking, so there wasn't even wine to keep me numb. There was less processing and more accepting. So much reality, and now I was expected to handle real life on my own. Karyn, let's start perhaps with some first thoughts. I know you've got some insights here. What first comes up for you when you hear that snippet of an experience for somebody?
Well, first, just how honestly it's shared and how much I always appreciate. You had already used the word authentic and the importance of being authentic with our grief and how we're coping and what the reality is of it. Because I think sometimes there's things that we have a difficult time saying or admitting to ourselves, maybe even the fact that the anticipation was worse than the day itself. I think there's so much that's relatable there, the pressure, the way an anniversary approaches, or really any grief date approaches, and you can start to feel a shift, and people will talk about it almost as something that they can feel in their body, without even having to look at the calendar, that we know that an important date is approaching, or that this time that could potentially, with all the days in grief being hard, but maybe even perhaps being harder. So I think just that, and how often that I do hear people say that the anticipation is such a really difficult part of all of it. In the end, the day comes and goes. It has the weight that we give it. I do talk to people a lot about how to get through the hard days of grief, but I think as we're going into the second year, especially, it's trying to figure out like, okay, what now? Like I expected to feel different or expected to feel further along. And I think coupled with that is the fact that people around us probably expect us to be doing a little bit better too. So, as she had said there, it's not worse, but, I say to people, sometimes it's not about it being worse or better, but it's different. It's just this constantly evolving and changing thing. And what was a difficulty or challenge in the first year may not necessarily be there in the same way, but it's probably been replaced with a new challenge, and something that a person's trying to work through.
I feel like there's a key word in all of this, and it's the key word of expectations. And what I like about this snippet that we are talking about is the person feels like they recognize that their expectations were going to limit them or help make things be worse or do something to set themselves up for lack of a better word, some kind of failure or some kind of suffering or something. And so with all that you manage and lead at Grief in Common, what's kind of your general consensus about expectations for people in grief as grief continues?
Yeah. Well, you're right. It is an important word. And it's one that I try to highlight often because it's such a big part of it. I mean, expectations are a big part of life, I think, in general, but especially in grief. They can be so impactful. And I think sometimes the hardest is the expectations that we put on ourselves. I'll talk to people a lot when I'm doing a group. We'll kind of go around, ask everybody who they are, who they lost, when it happened. It gives us some sense of where a person is at. But then I also try and pull back from that and say, but in the end, where you are is where you are. So if it's been 3 months, or if it's been 18 months, or if it's been 5 years, if you're here saying that you're struggling, that's where you're at. And the expectation of where you're supposed to be is not going to count, really, when it comes down to how we actually feel. I think we have that expectation that as time passes that we're going to just get progressively better. I mean, that's how it works. If we've had a fight with a friend, a little time and space helps. If we've been sick, as time passes, we can hopefully, feel better. But grief is much more up and down than that. And there isn't this steady climb upward with each day that passes. And I think that's frustrating and confusing and often makes people feel like they're doing it wrong or should be doing something differently.
With the large community at Grief in Common, are you seeing statements shared by grievers to help support each other, to help minimize, lower, or throw expectations out the window?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting. I'm always so amazed by the people who come to the website or come to a group for support and how often they're actually giving it. What's interesting is how well we're able to do that for other people, to give them that compassion, to give them that permission to take their time, and yet how hard that can be to do for ourselves. So that's often what I'm trying to work through with people is how loving and kind and understanding we are to our best friend or those that we love most, and how we need to be treating ourselves in the same way, to not be so tough on ourselves, to not give ourselves such a hard time, or to kind of punish ourselves in some ways, thinking that we should be doing better or doing more. Because on top of this, besides all of that, I think there's also the confusion of the times when someone does actually have a good day or a nice afternoon, or they laugh or enjoy themselves, and then the guilt, that can ultimately follow. So they're trying to balance feeling better, but then not feeling too much better, because then that can be confusing too. So there's just so much back and forth, but people are supportive of one another and do have a good way of letting them know that what they're going through is like, yeah, I feel the same thing. And that's what community support is about, is knowing that you're not alone.
Hmm. Well said. How about progress? I find progress so interesting in grief. It seems like in the Western culture, progress is something that everybody strives for, right? We want to do career development. We want personal growth. We
Mhm.
want better health. We're always aiming towards a better version of ourselves. And I definitely see value in that. I subscribe to that. But I get these experiences working with clients who are grieving, and also in my own grief process, where I'm like, gosh, I've really put an expectation on myself here. And I'll share something personally that, like, it's so interesting. I'm approaching 5-year anniversary of the death of my stepfather, and his death really helped launch me get into this type of work, grief support. And what I found so interesting is that as I think and reflect on my connection to him, I also think so much more about my biological father, who did die 15 years ago, and realize there's still a lot of healing in that aspect, still a lot of mending, reconnecting, redefining, and reintegrating our relationship. It wasn't the most beautiful relationship. There was alcoholism, post traumatic stress, a lot of complicated factors. And yet, I continue to recognize that, gosh, I'm catching myself all the time with these expectations where it's like, Reed, it's been 15 years. Like, why would you feel sad, about losing your father?
Yeah. And I think a lot of times people find themselves questioning, this process. What I try to remind people a lot of times is that we haven't done this before. Even if you've been a person that's had a lot of hardship and a lot of loss at different points throughout your life, you're different at each time. Each relationship is different. You're at a different age. How you've processed one loss or trauma is going to impact how you try to get through the next one. And if you haven't had a significant loss before, then you really are starting out with no guidebook and no idea of what this is supposed to be. And I think also the fact that so many people are grieving quietly and sort of secretly and behind closed doors, it always makes them feel like they're not measuring up somehow. I'll say to people often, they'll use the example like, well, my mom died and I felt like I couldn't go back to work, but when my coworker lost her mom, she seemed fine. And I'll try to remind them that she probably cried to and from work every day. She probably went home and put her pajamas on and didn't get out of them again, for the whole weekend. Like, there's so much that's happening that you can't see. It's the importance of having the dialogue of, in this forum or in a group setting, because then we can actually get some validation for the fact that we may not be doing as poorly as we think. But yeah, I think expectations are high. We want to be strong. I mean, think about all the things that you see out there, even just for, people who are going through cancer treatment. We're warriors and we're strong, and it's all about strength. And that's so much of what we expect to continue to do even in our grief. But there's so many layers to it, the nature of the relationship, how close we were to the person, how much our time and plans and day to day dependent on them, how much gets tied into the other people, or conversely, even when we have a complicated relationship with a person, then that's going to cause a complicated grief, because we're not only grieving this person that we loved, complications or not, but we're probably also mourning some of the things that didn't get said, can't be undone, or the things that could never be. So it's not always just about mourning the person, it's mourning all of the things that go with them. And it's the reason why, grief is so deep, lasts so long, and continues on. And what I say to people often is that I don't think the grief ever really goes away, because the love doesn't go away. And we don't want that to go away. So it's sort of like trying to find a way to integrate it, to let it be, make some space for it, and not be defined by it, but not to judge ourselves for it either. And it's a hard balance. And that, I think, takes a tremendous amount of time, even in our profession, even when we're trying to do this and help this, other people through it, it's still hard to do for ourselves.
Yes, it is. Karyn, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second.
Okay.
Let's say I approach you and I say, in your professional experience, I say, Karyn, I've been mourning for 22 years and I just feel like I'm stuck. What would be the first thing that you'd say in response?
Well, I have people like that. I work with a woman right now who lost her mom. So I guess the first thing again is kind of going back to the, like, let's throw the timeline away. Let's not, I'm not going to say not to worry, because of course the time does have an impact. And I imagine if 22 years of grieving has impacted other things, relationships, our ability to work, our, way that we would want to move forward. I think a lot of times it's a matter of like, well, let's look at the circumstances. In this particular case, this woman was very young. The death happened very quickly. There wasn't a lot of support. She was expected to be put in a position of making decisions for her mom that she didn't feel able to make. So when we started to break down sort of the why, and when I could help her understand, why it was so impactful all this time later. And that's a lot of times what I feel like people need is just a reason and an understanding of why this is going to be so particularly difficult. I just spoke to a woman yesterday, also lost her parents, and it had been, I think, 15 years. And she said she was feeling stuck. And when we talked about it, she realized that she made her decisions in life with her parents' guidance and permission. And if they gave the green light, if they said it was okay, then she felt okay making the decision, but without it, she felt stuck. So we talked about fear, and we talked about the things that prevent us from moving forward. So we're kind of looking at the whole picture. It's the loss itself, of course, but it's the way the loss has maybe stopped us in our tracks of feeling confident, of, maybe really impacting our self-esteem or our self-worth. I think that is something that is so underappreciated in the process of all this. It's like, of course, okay, we know we're going to be sad. Maybe there's going to be some anger, and some adjustment time. But what are all the other things that are impacted? Self-esteem is a big one. And so we start to get into these cycles of feeling like we can't do it, or it's not going to work, or we stop believing in ourselves, that our actions are going to make a difference. Or, what I hear all the times, well, what difference does it make? If I do all this, I can go out and I can get a new job, or I can meet some new people, or start a great hobby, but my loved one's still going to be gone. So I think people start to kind of lose a little bit of hope. And, then that cycle continues of sort of inaction where they get stuck. So what I try to remind people is that, when we say, what difference does it make? It's like, well, you already know what this looks like. You already know what being stuck looks like and feels like, and what inaction looks like. So what would an alternative be? And could it possibly make it feel a little bit different, or make these days a little bit more tolerable? And sometimes we're starting very small like that, and just trying to make our day to day, maybe even just a fraction better than it is right now. And I guess that's where we would start, and what that would mean individually for that person.
Okay, where can I sign up, please? Karyn, that was amazing. Way to put things into perspective. Oh my gosh. That was fantastic. I think I digress. I don't know if I've got anything more to say, but I know you did a great service to all of us for helping us understand that it's not only just about the loss, it's also about our self-worth and our self-esteem in relationship to the loss. Oh, Karyn, I hear too many people just say, gosh, I really suck at this grief thing. And my heart just sinks into my stomach when I hear that. I mean, it's almost like compassion just like bursts inside of me. And I'm like, please don't look at life that way. Please, please hold some of your own self-compassion. Like you said earlier in the conversation, you've never really done this before. Even if you've lost a grandparent or have lost another specific loved one, the relationship with this person is so unique to any relationship with anyone else.
Yeah, absolutely.
And those comparisons they don't measure up. There's really no significance to them.
Yeah. Well, and either we've done this before, and so we're only adding and compounding that grief, and new grief can bring up old grief. And so being an expert at grief doesn't necessarily make it easier, because then that just means you're someone who's had a lot of losses, and that can have its own weight and its own exhaustion that comes with it. Or, like we said, you've never done it before. So how are we supposed to know? But there is, as you said, expectation, and we're really, really tough on ourselves. And that is something I try to work on with people. Like you said, your heart just breaks. It's like, there's no pretty way to do this or good way to do this or way that you could put in a movie that would have it all fixed easily in a short period of time. It's just so much more complex than that, and there's so many more layers to it than we would expect. And I think it's because we go in thinking that grief is just sadness, that that's all it is, that it's tears, it's crying, maybe some longing, but we don't realize that how much more goes into it, how much more of our life is impacted by it, and how long it goes on for, with those things that continue to trigger us.
Well, Karyn, your skills and your expertise really comes out when you speak about this. I feel like I tried to stump you, but there's no stumping Karyn.
Well, I don't know about that, but thank you.
I want to appreciate and thank you for everything that you've shared today. And before we close out, you run Grief in Common. What's going on at Grief in Common?
Well, there's always something going on. And, we started out basically as a website to help people connect and to find each other. This was 5 years ago where it began. And that was mostly because, I found that people, sometimes it doesn't always feel like enough to just speak with another grieving person. We want to speak with the person who's had a similar loss to ours. If they've lost a parent, want to talk to somebody else who's lost a parent, but then maybe even more detailed than that, maybe similar circumstances. I have a woman I work with that only wants to go to a group with people who've lost their loved one to cancer. That's how she lost her loved one. And anything beyond that is something either she feels like she can't relate to, or she can't emotionally open herself up to, because even though she's got a very sad story, she feels like other people's stories could just be too sad. So that real kind of specific type of support was the idea behind it. We've got the live chat feature, which is newer in just the past year or so, which gives people a chance to kind of chat on the computer in real time. But I have support groups as well, grief groups that I run at least once a week. And then I try to do some specialized group for loss of parent, loss of spouse. Those are like 6-week sessions. I do the individual coaching and support. And then I also have our learning hub, which is an opportunity for people maybe who don't consider themselves to be a group person or don't necessarily have the time to be making appointments. They can kind of go in. It's almost like taking like a grief class, but there's videos, articles, assignments, and that's done over the course of 6 sessions for both the newly bereaved, second year and beyond, and allows people to take a really deep dive, but hopefully to come away with some actual tangible tools. Like, I think people are wondering, what do I do? So it does kind of give you some of that guidance of like, let's take this perspective. Let's try this way of thinking and see if perhaps that makes a difference. Because that's where so much of this begins and ends, is in our head. And so trying to work through whatever's going on in there is where we're going to find the biggest impact, I think.
2 things come to mind. Number 1, I've invested in one of your Learning Hub courses, Complicated Grief. I really enjoyed it. It helped give me a lot of insights into a complex topic. And so for you, if you're listening and you realize, I want to learn more about my grief process, I recommend checking out the Learning Hub at Grief in Common. And then number 2 is, I just want to admire how much community driven you are, Karyn. You sound so busy, and yet feel like you wear your heart on your sleeve to provide as much support as you can to the community of grievers that find you. So thank you very much. Truly, from the bottom of my heart, thank you.
No, you're welcome. Well, thank you. And for, all the work you're doing. I mean, I think, you understand as well as I do the real love that is in this work. I mean, sometimes it sounds strange to tell someone about it, what you do or why you do it. But I think we're so pulled toward it. And I feel so committed and strongly about helping people and, wanting to provide sort of that practical approach, I guess. There's a lot of stuff out there, but we're all real people in a real world, and wanting to make it accessible so that it fits into our schedule. Sometimes I feel like it would almost seem like grief or grief help is a luxury that, maybe we feel like we don't have time for, but it's so important. And it's such an honor. I mean, I think that. I mean, it's just such an honor that people bring their stories and their life and their vulnerability to you. So I feel, and I say this really truthfully, very honored to be able to do it. So thank you. And as I said, thank you for all the work you're doing.
It truly is an honor. And so my last question to you today, Karyn, is, I'm sure you get asked all the time, why do you do the work that you do?
Yeah, if people even want to talk about it sometimes, I think just even, you tell them what you do and they're like, oh, okay. Yes, if people ask, it's interesting. I'm not necessarily a religious person. I guess I'm spiritual in the way that probably people do this work are searching for some of those answers and trying to understand things better. So it sounds religious to say it, and I don't mean it in that way, but it is a calling. I do it because I can. I do it because there's something in me that feels like, I don't know, like I just need to, do it. It means so much. And it's, I guess, I think it's so rewarding. It's so surprisingly rewarding. And that's what people probably wouldn't understand. But to be able to watch someone grow through their grief and the resilience, that we demonstrate, however much time that takes or however small it seems. And for people to surprise themselves and to kind of celebrate their victories with them. And oftentimes they're really small things, but I say, but they're not small at all. Mowing your lawn when your husband did it for you for 40 years and you did it for the first time is huge. And, so being able to celebrate that with someone and remind them how proud they should feel, it just really feels like you're on the journey with them. And it's just amazing to see. We're so much more adaptable than we think we are. And even though I know grieving people don't particularly like being called strong, because then they'll say, well, I don't feel like I have a choice. But there is this innate strength, I think, in the human spirit that is really amazing to see up close. And so, I think I couldn't imagine doing anything else. I'll put it that way.
Karyn, you've got a heart of gold. Thanks for being on Grief Refuge.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much. It was my pleasure. I really, like I said, grateful for the work you're doing and for all that you're putting out there for people. I think this is so important.
Thank you so much for joining me. It's such an honor to hold space for your grief and your healing. To learn more about Karyn's work, visit griefandcommon.com. And if you found this podcast episode to be helpful, let us know by leaving a rating and review or sending us a message at griefrefuge.com. Before saying goodbye today, I want to remind you there's a new app available for you, all at your fingertips. It's called Grief Refuge. You can download it for free by searching Grief Refuge, either on the App Store or the Google Play Store. If you're still not sure about what this Grief Refuge app is, well, it's a daily companion to help navigate your grief journey. It provides comfort and solace in a time of need. It's a digital platform to help hold space for your grief. So if grief is making you feel lost or isolated right now, download Grief Refuge for free to start feeling more comfort and support. Thank you, take care, keep honoring your grief, be kind to yourself, and talk to you soon.